Hello there. Today we're going to be talking about yoga and the body. When I was teaching at another university, when I was hired, they asked me to develop a course on yoga. So I developed a course called Yoga, History, and I did it for 10 weeks. I taught that class a number of times, and I really enjoyed it. I hadn't really thought too much about yoga at that point. I practiced yoga when I first went to India in the 90s, and I studied with a guy who was a yoga practitioner and also a philosopher. And I was good at it. He told me I was kind of naturally good at it, that I had a good build for it, I had the right sort of disposition for it. And I kept it up for a couple of years, but I stopped and I never really thought about yoga again. And I had this idea always that I was doing some 2,000-year-old practice. Little did I know, yoga as it's practiced, this sort of yoga of doing different poses in a sequence, is really only about 100, 150 years old. So let's get into that kind of interesting history and wonder how we got from solitary dudes living in caves with dreadlocks covered in ashes to, you know, yoga moms. Let's get there. So what do you think of when you think of yoga or when you hear the word yoga? You know, most people sort of think about fitness. You know, you're making the body stretchy and bendy and more efficient and more effective. It's to de-stress. It's to get a good looking, sexy body. And we see these, like, we see yoga studios, we see yoga classes in gyms, we see yoga videos on the internet, or people buy yoga DVDs. You see Yoga Journal, which is on all of the newsstands everywhere. You have this very popular publication called Yoga Journal. And I had a subscription at one point. It's kind of ridiculous, especially after you see what we'll be talking about today. So yoga in general these days might be done in private, you know, while you're watching a yoga video, or you might do it in groups, but the majority of people practice yoga in groups, which is intriguing because the whole idea of doing yoga in a group would be somewhat anathema to traditional yogis. The idea of going to a yoga class would be weird too. Your teacher would just teach you the forms and then you do them, but you wouldn't do them in a group and following along. And I think that has to do with how we have like an understanding of exercise in our Western culture, and we've adapted yoga to fit that exercise format. So yoga that we see these days is predominantly a woman's activity. You see that there are quite a few sort of male yogi teachers, but when if you go to any standard yoga classes, you'll see one, maybe two, and often no males practicing yoga. That's not to say there aren't men that do yoga, but yoga is practiced very, very widely and not by very many men, and there's a lot of gendered reasons for that. Now, yoga in India is a male activity. I'm not saying that there were never female practitioners or female yogis, and there are definitely people that do yoga now who are female, but they do this more modern style. But traditionally in the text, we have no female perspective. Some scholars have written and said that we think there were women doing yoga, maybe their husbands were yogis, but we don't have any like definitive texts that are written from a woman's perspective, yet again. So remember, in the study of religion, we should challenge anytime the male gaze is universal and wonder, well, maybe they were there and they just didn't get recorded, or maybe they were never there and yoga has always been patriarchal. So yoga in the West is taught by yoga instructors, who are basically the equivalent of like aerobics instructors when I grew up, or personal trainers. I mean, it's broadly a body action that is done for health and longevity, and it is largely divorced from any religious exertion or generation of magic powers. Yeah, I'm going to talk about magic powers again, because so much of religion up until the modern time in this sort of disenchanted modern world was about just that. Transactions with deities and gaining magic powers. So at the same time, yogic practitioners will say, even though they're realizing that it's this very health-oriented thing, that yoga practitioners and instructors will argue that yoga is a 5,000-year-old tradition in India. Well, we're going to say yes and no. The answer is often both and. So we're going to see that most yoga that is rooted in Indian practices is fused with Western notions of the body, Western notions of health. But it's also quite Hindu these days, because, how to say this better? Yoga is thought to be this 5,000-year-old tradition. We have usage of the term yoga in the very early Vedas, but the specific practices that we see in the modern era are not found there. And we're going to complicate that a bit. So yoga is actually a cluster of practices that are physical and mental that aim to cultivate transcendent states and create magic powers. Yoga can be found in all Indian religions, but the majority of yogis are actually Hindus. Yoga manipulates the body to support meditative practices. Now, I said that contemporary yoga is divorced from its Hindu context, but just recently, the Hindu nationalists, people who believe that India for the Hindus and that Hinduism is the greatest religion of all time, have claimed that modern postural yoga is inherently Indian, and is the product of Hinduism. So while yoga may not actually, in its process, be the product of any one religion, we see that contemporary people are arguing that it is. So therefore, it is. All right, so here is a wonderful quote by my advisor, David White, that I think summarizes the issue with yoga. The word yoga is tricky because it has so many meanings. That comes from the Sanskrit root that just means huge, which means to like join or even to like hitch up a chariot to a wagon. Some people say it's union with God. Some people say it's the union of nature and the self. And I like to stick with yoga, and I don't translate it because it's one of the most vast words in the Sanskrit language. So yoga has a wider range of meaning than nearly any other word in the entire Sanskrit lexicon, or the body of Sanskrit words. The act of yoking an animal, as well as the yoke itself, is called yoga. In astronomy, a conjunction of planets or stars, as well as a constellation, is called yoga. When one mixes together various substances, that too can be called yoga. The word yoga has also been used and employed to denote a device, a recipe, a method, a strategy, a charm, an incantation, fraud, a trick, an endeavor, a combination, union, an arrangement, zeal, care, diligence, industriousness, discipline, use, application, contact, a sum total, and the works of an alchemist. But remember, man into alchemy, lead into gold, man into God man. But this is by no means an exhaustive list. You could go on. You can go on like crazy. The word yoga comes up all the time, and it has so many different meanings. So if somebody just says to you, oh, yoga is union with God, or yoga is union of mind and body, it's like, it's a lot of things. Those contacts are there, but they're not all that there is. So where does yoga come from? I like to think of yoga as having three distinct stages. One is Patanjali yoga, so that's about the 4th century or the 400s. Then you have the yoga of yogis, so dudes practicing yoga, and that's Hathayoga that goes on from, it depends on how you want to date it, but it gets really big in the 15th century, so 1400s into, I'd probably say the 18 or 1900s. We'll talk about that in a second. And then finally, modern postural yoga, which is the yoga that you see practiced all over the place today. So the Patanjali wrote a text called the Yogasutras. So the Yogasutras are a collection of 196 short verses that are called sutras, sutra from the Sanskrit root su, which is the same as suture, like to stitch together, like we have in English. And there's the idea that a Sanskrit book would be a whole bunch of stacks of pages with a hole in the middle, and then you would run a thread through that hole to keep the book together. It would be bound books like we think of books now. So sutra. All right, so we know he authored the Yoga Sutras at some point around the 400s, so during the 5th century. We know very little about Patanjali, though there are multiple figures who bear the name Patanjali, ranging from a grammarian, a guy that writes on Sanskrit grammar, this yoga author, and various alchemists. I could add more. There's a lot of Patanjalis. If you go into a yoga studio, though, people will tell you all about Patanjali, and all of that is kind of made up. We don't really have any historical knowledge of it, but we have some mythological knowledge. There's one story that his mother was holding up her hands in reverence to the gods and begging for a child, and a snake fell into the hand. Ah, a snake! And from there, she dropped the snake turned into Patanjali. It's a story. It's interesting. Okay, so Patanjali defines the Yoga Sutra, or defines yoga as yogas chitta vritti nirodha. So that literally means yoga is the cessation of the turnings of the mind. Nirodha, stopping. Vritti, turning or action. Chitta, mind, not consciousness, but mind. And yoga, so yoga is the cessation of the turnings of the mind. So already, he says this in like right up in the first verses. He says, this is what yoga is. He doesn't say anything about body positions. All right. In the Yoga Sutras, we have a number of kind of wild things. The most important is that they have the famous 8 limbs of yoga that nearly every source on yoga in English will write about. Really, they're all numbers of yogic systems. Some might have 6, some might have 4, some might have 16, some might have 8. So these angas or limbs or parts or components can be a lot of things. The word for yoga is Om, and in fact, in the Yoga Sutras, it's said that you can gain liberation or you can gain complete fulfillment just by meditating on the word Om. So you sit there and go Om, 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 and that'll get you there. I know one scholar, a very famous scholar, says, yeah, I tried that one time. I thought about Om for about 5 minutes, and I thought, I'd rather think about a whole bunch of other stuff than this. I always kind of like that story. All right, so the Om. There's also a figure that they describe as Yogeshwara, the Lord of Yoga, is described in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. We don't know if that's Shiva. We don't know if it's Krishna. For the most part, people think that it's Krishna, like here on the left. But Shiva's the guy that's always doing yoga and meditating. So I think it would be Shiva more likely. And Yogeshwara sounds like a Shiva name. But we don't know who this is. A lot of people, there's no specific god attached to this title, Yogeshwara. So maybe he was an independent deity at the time, and this is our just record of him. It's hard to say. So what are the 8 limbs of yoga? If we're going to even really talk about yoga or think about yoga, we have to run through this. So these are the 8 limbs of yoga, the 8 components of yoga as explained by Patanjali in his Yoga Sutras. This can be found in Yoga Sutra, Book 2, it starts on verse 28 and 29. All right, so what are the 8 limbs? The 8 limbs start with yama and niyama. Yama is like moral principles or things you're not supposed to do. These are the don'ts. These are the yama and niyama. The first 2 limbs are the do's and the don'ts of yogas. So what is yama? What is the moral principle? It says non-violence, truthfulness or non-stealing, refraining from lying, celibacy, and renunciation of unnecessary possessions. And I'll leave the Sanskrit off on that for you this time. Okay, what's the next one? Asana. Okay, this one we know. This is what we think of. Asana means posture, position, or seat. In fact, the Sanskrit phrase is sthira sukhamasanam, which means the posture should be steady or comfortable. To which I would ask to you, the guy on the right looks steady and comfortable. The guy on the left, not as much to me. So when you see some of these crazy body positions, remember that the Yoga Sutras, this primary text for yoga, just says it should be firm and it should be comfortable. 4, pranayama. Prana, we had that word before. Prana means like subtle force, energy, life force. And ayama means to extend or to work with, to manipulate, to exercise. Pranayama is breath control. It is letting forth and restraining breath. Sometimes it's holding breath in. Sometimes it's like you see these guys doing, they bring their hands and they breathe in one nostril and out the other. And that's supposed to do something. The idea is you do these breathing exercises where you like breathe really fast or breathe really slow, and it regulates the body and builds up your physiology and whatnot. It's a lot of kind of interesting stuff about how the breath connects to the body, connects to religious experience. Okay, then you have pratyahara, withdrawal. Pratyahara, when I say withdrawal, means withdrawal of the brain from sense objects. It's said to be like a turtle that pulls all its arms into its shell. So pratyahara means removing the senses from contact with external objects. This reveals the true nature of the mind when you've withdrawn. So when the senses, the phrase says, when the senses do not come into contact with their respective sense objects. All right, so here there's going to be a little shift from here. We've seen mostly sort of physical practices. Now we're going to move into more kind of mentalish practices. Focus, dharana. So dharana, or concentration, the phrase is actually concentration is fixing the mind in one place. So your brain is usually all over the place, put it on one thing. Maybe it's the om. Maybe it's just focused on nothing. It's probably focused on something. So focusing the mind. It's good for everyone. Then we have dhyana, from which we get the word meditation. Intriguingly, dhyana in Sanskrit goes to China and becomes chan, and then chan goes to Japan and becomes Zen. So dhyana is actually Zen, if you want to think about it widely. In meditation, we see the description is meditation is the one-pointedness of the mind on one image. So it overlaps with focus and dharana. Unless you want to get really technical, don't worry about understanding that too hard. But just focus, dharana focus, jhana meditation. That's all you need. Finally, we have the eighth limb, which is samadhi, which means sort of like union, result, or it literally means putting everything together. And it's described as being in varied levels, whether it has contents or doesn't have contents. But I like to think of samadhi as the end result of yoga. It's not necessarily enlightenment, but it's being in that state. One scholar said, samadhi is when dhyana shines forth as the object alone and the mind is devoid of its own reflective nature, which is a lot of mouthful. I like to think it's the end state. It's like sort of like pure contemplation is meditation that illumines the object alone, as if the subject were devoid of intrinsic form. I define it that dhyana exists illuminating only itself and exists in its true form, i.e. it is empty. That's my translation of the verse. All right, so the next phase outside of the Yogasutras is we're moving into like the 14th century and onward up until the time of British colonial rule, and then we'll get into the modern era. So the yoga of yogis. So yogis are practitioners of yoga, and I'm particularly talking about Indian yogis here. So there are occasionally descriptions of guys who are householder yogis who maintain a family and a home, but the majority of them would have been renunciate ascetics. They would have renounced the world to wander, and they're called sadhus. Sadhu just means good. Yes, in media and narrative lore, so if you watch a lot of Indian soap operas and movies, yogis are usually the bad guys. They're almost always the bad guys. So there's also a lot of long folk and literary histories about yogis manipulating kings, using their magic powers to control people, seducing ladies, tricking people into eating their children. Yogis are bad. My Sanskrit teacher would always say that, and he's Nepali, he would say that, when he was bad, his mother would say, if you're not good, if you don't behave, I'm going to tell the yogi and he's going to come and snatch you away into the night. So intriguingly, we have these figures of these yogis always being sort of ambivalent. And in fact, bad guys, when I started watching Indian movies, I was like, why are all these yogis, who I always thought would be these, enlightened, glorious beings, why are they always doing such horrible things and manipulating people? Well, there's an ambivalence around the figure of the yogi. So these yogis, these yogis, we find sort of 14th, 15th century, practice a practice called Hathayoga. Hatha means something like violent or forceful. So if I said, Hatina Mushti, Hatina Mushti, I can't remember the word for strike, Hathaye for that matter. I would go, it would mean I strike someone violently with my fist. So, Hatha means forceful or violent, as in the violent exertion. In this, the body is pushed and manipulated to enable changes in states of consciousness. They do some body positions, but that's not it. So what they would do is they have, a sequence of body positions that they hold for a really long time, or they just do one body position and they hold it for a long time to support meditation and to some degree to build up the body. The idea is the bodily practices in Hatha Yoga are used to enable the mental function. So if you're going to do these body positions, you would be doing them so your body's strong enough to be able to do more rigorous mental meditative practices. Like I said, these body positions are thought to build up the body to enable meditations and austerities. You'll see also Babas, or what means father, so like yogis, and like one I know pretty well is named Kade Baba, and the idea is he stands. He's always standing. He never sits down. I think he actually lays down when no one's looking. But you'll have some that like hold their arm up for their entire lives until their arm gets all atrophied and gnarly. So the idea is they show their power, their physical power, and their ability to sort of transcend the limitations of the normal body. This is a contemporary picture of a bunch of gatherings of sadhus. I believe this is the Kumbh Mela, which is every 12 years there's this big festival where all the yogi sadhus from all over the country come and hang out. And the tricky thing about these yogis is they can be a little violent. And there's a lot of laws that go back to the colonial era about how yogis aren't allowed to carry weapons. And you keep reading these laws about why yogis shouldn't carry weapons, and you go, oh shit, they were carrying weapons. Why were they always carrying weapons? What's going on there? Okay, so yogis would organize themselves into networks of gurus and disciples. They use this word akhara, which means like academy or even army. These groups would often form into mercenary armies, serving whichever king would hire them. In this, their physical yogic practices to enable meditation and whatnot was also combined with specific styles of weapon usages and yogi martial arts. So these guys would train their bodies to be strong. They have yogi martial arts, and for that matter, the word akhara is also used for groups of wrestlers together. They're training in wrestling. So weapons training, martial arts, strong bodies, organized into armies. They would be hired by whatever king would pay, and they'd go off and they were professional armies. So yogis were also mercenaries. These yogi armies would side with the Indian kingdoms against the British. And this is probably the root of why the British, when they colonized India, had so much crackdown on yogis, because they'd be like, oh no, yogis can't hang out, we're going to disperse them. Oh no, they can't have weapons, we got to disperse them. Because they were afraid the yogis would rise up and kick them out of India. We have a wide range of texts on Hatha Yoga, but they're only starting to get researched and presented. These texts describe sort of a wide range of bodily practices to enable meditative techniques and reach transcendent states and also to seek bodily immortality. Much of these techniques overlap with alchemy. Remember, alchemy led into gold, man into God-man. So yes, we're only now seeing extensive editing and translation of these sources. Prior to the last 10 years, the majority of all studies of yoga were based on that one text, the Yogasutras that I was just talking to you about. Texts like this book on the right, Roots of Yoga, which you read for today, they present these sources and reveal that there was an incredible diversity of discourse and writing on yoga, and its connections, in fact, are really close to Tantra. We see that they pick up quite a bit of Tantra, specifically chakras, the visualized body, Kundalini. A lot of these ideas are borrowed right out of the Tantras. The key to understanding Hatha Yoga is to understand the Hatha Yoga body, or the yoga body. Now, in this, there's the idea that you have the central channel, the Sushumna, and then you have two other channels, the Ida and Pingala, and they have all sorts of energy that flows in them. And then the chakras run straight down the middle. But furthermore, there's an idea that there are physical parts to that. Well, somewhat metaphysical parts to that body, but more sort of, how to put it? Okay, I'm going to talk about hydraulics and semen once again. Don't worry, we're going to get done with all this talk about sexual fluids at some point. All right, so when a man eats food, it's processed to become bodily substances, whether that's phlegm or blood or flesh or, or urine, whatever. Urine, feces, all of these things are created from food originally. The idea is that semen is thought to take the largest amount of food to create the smallest amount of substance. Such is very potent, it's very powerful, it's very precious even, they would say. You could make one example and say it takes a gallon of milk to make 1 ounce of semen, but it takes a gallon of milk to make a pound of blood. That's one way to think of it. So when we eject semen, when we express semen in ejaculation, it's a waste. But it also depletes the body. Remember me saying this before. The more that a man ejaculates, the more he loses subtle life force. And if he ejaculates too much, he'll die young. This is what they call Gupta Rog, the hidden disease. All right, so instead of expelling the semen, the yogi uses varied body techniques and meditation to preserve that semen and force it up that central channel so it goes into the head, is transmuted into nectar, which then flows down, creating bodily immortality, magical powers, all sorts of craziness, bodily perfection. Some yoga schools took this to the logical conclusion and would have a lot of practices where you would stand on your head. The idea being that the semen would drip down to the head because you're standing on your head. Now you might ask, what is the female component to it? We have a little bit of writing that says that there's a female retas, or seed, that would either be, I don't know, vaginal secretions or menstrual blood. There's some writing that said, oh yeah, women can do this with a female retas, but it never explains it in any way. The idea of retaining menstrual blood for long periods of time seems unfeasible, likely pretty dangerous. Okay, so Hatha yogi practitioners actually take up quite a bit from Tantra lore, such as Kundalini and the chakras. Remember, chakra, C-A-K-R-A, chakra, not chakra, chakra. If you remember anything from this, chakra, not chakra. Chakra just means wheel. That's all it means. So they take up Kundalini and chakras. The visualized body is almost identical to what we saw in Tantra, but these yogis are less ritualistic. They spend their main activities are bodily practices, meditation, and as James Mallinson says, sitting around a sacred fire. He says it's actually quite boring. A yogi's life is mostly meditating and sitting around a fire doing very, very little. Modern postural yoga. Let's get to what we see in the gym today. So modern postural yoga is a blanket term for the physical exercise type of yoga. I would argue that there are two Indian yoga figures that are the most important that inspired this type of practice. There would be a guy named Krishnamacarya and a guy named BKS Iyengar. I tried to meet Iyengar when he was live. I never got the chance. One of his students actually said BKS stands for beat, kick, and slap, because he was known for being very rigorous, like being a very good teacher. We'd be doing yoga and he'd come over and like and adjust you into like a much more painful version. And he'd be like, yeah, all right, that's how you got to do it. So he was known for being very stern, very tough. And he would do these things called adjustments. He would adjust your body to get you into the perfect position. And he hurt people. Yeah. He said, oh, it was all in the benefit and they practiced more, but we have tons of evidence of people getting physically injured by this. He was no medical doctor, and that's always irked me quite a bit. Anyway, so who is Krishnamacharya? Here's our first guy. He was a Brahmin who aspired to be a Sanskrit scholar, but he was really skilled at yoga and sort of very traditional yoga, so that would have been a couple of sequences and some meditation. Anyway, he manages to get to Mysore, a kingdom in South India, and he was sponsored by a king there who hired him to basically develop this yoga school. Now, he claimed to have traveled throughout the Himalayas where a guru, specifically like a Tibetan guru, taught him this new elaborate system of asanas. The system was more complicated, had more positions, linked those positions into sequences, and connected those specific body positions and movement to breathing. This actually became what he calls vinyasa. He does vinyasa school, which means something like, connected movings and connected movements. So he would slowly introduce new body positions to his students when he thought they were ready. Traditionally, it's said that there are 84 yoga positions, but we have next to no texts that have argued this. He said he got the core 84 from this guru who was never found. He was also said to consult a Sanskrit source that described all the positions that he taught. However, we've never been able to locate that text, and it wasn't where he said it was. I think we can be pretty sure. He was an innovator. He would work with students, and if he saw them doing something new that looked like it would work, he would turn that into a body position and he would perform it. As you can see, he lived to be quite old. 1888 to 1989, that's an old guy. So, all right, where did Krishnamacharya get his background? Krishnamacharya, he connected sort of the idea of yoga and the practices of yogis, but he also connected them with a lot of other ideas like military kinesthetics and calisthenics, pan-Indian ideas of body culture and exercise. In fact, we found that he actually was quite knowledgeable of gymnastics because there were some Swedish gymnastic texts that were translated into Indic languages, and we know that he consulted them. So he was an Orthodox Brahmin, but he taught really widely, even to a few Westerners, not as many as our next guy. He was ecumenical in his religious teaching. So he wasn't really religious. He'd be like, I'm a Hindu, that's the best way to do it. But you should be thinking about God. I think of Vishnu. You think about, I don't know, your God. And if you don't believe in a God, you think of your parents. So he would kind of meet his disciples where they were religiously and just like would adjust any of his lore to kind of fit and be more universal. He was not a medical doctor. He had some training in Ayurveda. Ayurveda is sort of the science of longevity and extending life, which uses medicines and herbs and balances to extend one's life. He had all these innovative positions that he developed through teaching. So his students became almost like a teaching or a yoga laboratory where he developed this new style of yoga, and he got incredible results. People became very healthy, became very strong. And if you meet people that practice Krishnamacharya's style, you'll notice they have a particular look. They get long, they get lean, they get slender and very muscular. So this form of yoga that he taught is called vinyasa, and it becomes the basis of almost all the elements that you find in modern postural yoga. What's most important to remember here is that he would teach postures in a sequence. So it wouldn't be just one posture, meditate. You would do a number of postures in specific set sequences and connect that to the breath as well. When you're looking at all these guys, they say they're doing Ashtanga yoga. So Ashtanga, the 8-limbed yoga, is what Krishnamacharya said he was doing. But in reality, he was only using 2 of the angas. He was only doing the, He was only doing asana, posture, and pranayama, breath stuff. And the breath stuff comes later in his life. So vinyasa goes worldwide. So you can see that all sorts of people do this type of practice of complicated and increasingly complicated yogic positions that are done in sequences, and in time were taught in classes. And I still think it's weird that we do yoga classes, because in all of the evidence of yogic practice, even amongst like the vinyasa of Krishnamacharya, you would have like a whole bunch of people doing different sequences in class, and you would go around and help them out. But you wouldn't have everybody doing the exact same positions. That's something that is very Western, and as I've said, I think comes out of exercise culture. Now, good old beat, kick, and slap. BKS Iyengar, 1918 to 2014. Again, this guy had good genes. He was actually sort of tangentially related to Krishnamacharya, like a couple of people removed. So these guys might have some pretty darn good genes. He definitely has good genes for having great eyebrows. He writes here, the art of teaching is tolerance. Humbleness is the art of learning. The funny thing is that he was known for being not exactly a raging egomaniac, but he was known in his younger days for being quite fiery. So BKS Iyengar studied with Krishnamacharya at a really young age. He went to Mysore, but it's not clear how much he really learned or how closely he studied with the guru. In fact, Krishnamacharya would often joke that his poorer health would never allow him to really excel at yoga. In time, he actually became remarkably healthy, and he said yoga actually caused him to become healthy and cured his illnesses. This is a common story. Like I have a good friend, when I asked him, like, how did you get into this yoga thing? And he said he got really sick. He tried everything, it didn't work. And he said, well, I'll try yoga, and it worked. So I wonder, we think about yoga as health. Maybe there is something inherently healthy about this. It's movement, it's flexibility. These are all good things. It just doesn't look like, when we look at any of the texts before, the 20th century. All right, so eventually Iyengar was told by Krishnamacharya to move to Bangalore, which, no, he went to Pune, not Bangalore. He went to Pune, which is out by Bombay, so a couple hundred miles away, and set up shop, start teaching. And over time, Iyengar became quite successful. His yoga system is similar to Krishnamacharya, but he made some changes. He developed new body positions, and he gave them all very clear Sanskrit names that he made up. They are not traditional names. They were not linked back to any specific practices that we can find in texts or evidence of that yogis practice. And he as well, oh, by the way, both these guys say yoga comes from the Yogasutras. It's unclear how, but they always say, the two of them, when they were interviewed, they'd say, what's the source on this? They'd say the Yogasutras. And I don't know why anybody wasn't just like, hey, but it's only got one verse, and it said the asana should be made dhrida and sukham. It should, the body position should be firm and comfortable, and nothing that it looks like all they're doing is comfortable. So he would actually encourage people to use belts, blocks, and blankets to enable the yoga training. You'll see those in yoga classes today, and just that's from him. That was his innovation. His yoga was deeply physical and strenuous, thought to bring about general health, but also being able to remedy physical ills. He wrote this incredibly important book that you can find on every yogi's bookshelf anywhere called The Light on Yoga. I remember my yoga teacher when I said, how am I going to keep doing this if I don't live in India? He said, well, get light on yoga and just start working through it. And I did. I got fair ways. But if you look through Light on Yoga, you will see some pretty amazing things. Now, the interesting thing about Light on Yoga is that he describes clear methods for getting into and performing these body positions and connects those specific positions to body therapies, building up organs, healing, and health benefits. He was not a medical doctor in any way. He had no training to be able to assess that. So I take him with a grain of salt. Yes. So he taught many, many, many Westerners, and these Westerners, his disciples, brought Iyengar to the world. Even if a yoga practice, if you walk into a yoga studio, they say it's not based on Iyengar, you can see his influence in almost anything that's practiced in a yoga studio. The other cool thing about Light on Yoga, I have my copy handy, is that it has lots of pictures. This is the first time we had a lot of photographic evidence of people performing these yogic positions. And if you look at them, if you were to pick up this book at your local store, you would look at them and go, ah, how did he do that? I mean, how did he get the soles of his feet onto the top of his head? It's kind of amazing. It's sort of terrifying. Okay. He also said that this was an 8-limb yoga, but there was really only one limb. It was really only asana, namely body positions. And he also, especially toward the end of his life, said that the Yogasutras were the root of everything he did. So, like I said, here's some pictures of Iyengar at various phases of his life. In the middle, he's like in his 50s. On the right, he's probably in his 80s or 90s. He was known in his 90s to be able to practice almost as strenuously as he could in his 30s. He was really an incredible teacher and physical specimen. So what's the takeaway on all of this? Well, we have different modes of yoga, including meditation and body position. So let's just split it in half. You got meditation and you got getting yourself into bodies. These are two viable ways of doing yoga. So what does it mean that they're connected? What does it mean that one group plays up body more, especially nowadays, and one group played up, and in the past would play up meditation more? What does that tell us about these practices? For the more mystic world of the Yoga Sutra, well, we have the mystical world of the Yoga Sutras. We have the violent exertions of the yogis to gain power and immortality, and yoga for exercise, as we see now. How are those connected? How can they be the same? Because they seem so different. This is why we're looking at the body. This is why we're looking at religion. This is why we're looking at yoga, because one thing might not be the other thing, or maybe it's a version of the other. Why do you think about that? All three of these modes embrace the body as a place of experience, especially religious experience. When you think about the Western concern for exercise, I think it sort of does have a religious component. So, you know, somebody that jogs every day is considered virtuous. If you go to California and you listen to the way people talk about somebody who's got a few extra pounds on them, you realize that there's a connection of virtue to exercise and fitness. So whereas someone like, you know, in the Catholic Church in the medieval era would have been thought to be very devoted, to be very pious, I feel like we look at people and talk about people who exercise a lot in a way that signals virtue. All right, individual versus group practices. Like I said, all these practices of yoga were individual. They weren't done in a group. Then we go to yoga classes. Even in India, you have large groups of people that do yoga all together. So what does that show? And is that just an influence on exercise culture in the West and doing classes and doing motions together? Probably going back to military calisthenics. So what does it mean that we practice them in classes, but traditionally yoga was done individually? Yes, so yoga is often compared to prayer by cross-cultural religious thinkers, but that really depends on how you conceive of prayer, right? I mean, is prayer a mental conversation with God? What is the position of your body when you pray? Can prayer be any state of heightened awareness of God and the self? So if I'm out, you know, gardening and I have a heightened awareness of God, is that physical activity prayer? Can you pray doing yoga and be a good Christian? There have been a wide number of arguments on that within the Catholic Church. Some Catholic figures saying, no, you'll get possessed by demons. Others saying, nope, that's Hinduism. Others saying, no, this is just embodied prayer, and if you use it that way, it'll be good. There's no clear agreement on all of those. Why do you think it is that all of these groups were convinced that they could become immortal? I mean, yoga leads to immortality in almost all of these sort of yogic sources, but no one is immortal. No one in the history of life is immortal, or we'd see them, we'd know about them. So why does this continue to be a goal? What do you think about these two notions of sexual fluids? So we have semen, it can become a powerful substance used in worship in Tantra. And then in yoga, it is a powerful substance is to be retained and transmuted and turned into a nectar that will give you bodily immortality and powers. And also, what does it mean when a practice like yoga is taken out of its context? Namely, it's Indian, but now it's no longer Indian, or it's Indian and more. What does it mean that something originates in one place and can change so much? Is it still the same thing, or is it a different thing? Food for thought. All right, I will catch you on the flip side.